Over the course of this and several videos, I'm going to be building a sample application that uses both the management and execution web services in order to access the report server and execute a report. Now, the application that I'm going to build is an ASP.NET MVC page, and it displays a list of reports that the user can choose from, as well as the list of render formats that they can use to export the report, including HTML. So the page is going to use the report server web service to retrieve the list of reports and formats using the web service for the user to select from. And that'll be using the management web service, because that gives me access to a list of reports that are available on the report server that I'm connecting to. And then the user has the option of executing the report, and they can do it in two different ways. The first is to use the report execution web service. And then the other way is by building a custom URL to deliver the report in the chosen format to the user. Now, these are fairly simple uses of the web services, but they do serve as a good demonstration of how to use them so you can build bigger and better applications based on all of the features in the two different web services. In this exercise, I'm going to create an empty ASP.NET MVC project and add web references to the report server web services in order to access the sample reports on a local instance of reporting services. And then I'll explore some of the feature of the web services using the tools that are available in Visual Studio. Alright, so here I am within Visual Studio. It happens to be Visual Studio 2013 Ultimate Edition. And I'll do File, New Project, as usual. This is a web project. It's going to be an ASP.NET web application. I'm going to put it in the sample files folder that I have, whatever is convenient. And I'm going to name the application Report Runner, because that's ultimately the purpose of this particular application. All right, I'll click on OK. And because I selected that ASP.NET application type, I get this new ASP.NET project dialog box. As you can see, I have the option of several different project templates: Web Forms, MVC, Web API, which is if you want to create your own web service, single page application, particular kind of ASP.NET application, and if I'm going to do something for Azure, I can use that project template. Now, this is going to be an MVC application, but I'm not going to select this template right here. The reason is that this sample project template brings along a lot of other cruft that I just don't need for the simple sample application. Things to support authentication and various other services, nice sample pages with links to learning about writing ASP.NET applications. I just don't want all that stuff. I do want the overall structure of an MVC application though. So I'm going to select the empty template and tell it to add folders and core references for MVC. So this way, the overall project structure is going to be there for an MVC application, as well as some of the JavaScript and core .NET framework references, but not a lot of extra code, not a lot of extra files, and so forth. I'll have to do a little bit more work in order to build the things, but not all that much, and it has the benefit of being just a much more lightweight application. And in particular, I get along no support for authentication. I could add support later if I wanted to, but I would have to do all the work of adding all the classes and so forth and references in order to implement all that. And I'm not going to host it on Microsoft Azure, but I could if I wanted to and select various options there. Okay, now just be aware that you may have previously used this dialog box and you may get different default options than you saw when I first loaded this up on my machine. In particular, very often I found that host in the cloud is checked by default. But since I've previously unchecked that, it's no longer checked here. So it tends to remember your default values. All right, I'll go ahead and click on OK, and it'll go out and create that project as well as the project structure for this ASP.NET MVC application. All right, and that's done. Almost done. There we go. And as you can see here in Solution Explorer, I have the basic outline. If you're familiar with ASP.NET MVC applications, I have a place for app data, app start, controllers, models, and views. And I'll be putting some things in each of those folders as I progress through, showing you how to implement this application. But first what I want to do is that I know that I'm going to be using both of the web services that are exposed by reporting services within the application. So I first need to add a web reference to this project. Now, the process to do this was frankly a little bit more straightforward in earlier versions of Visual Studio than 2013 that I'm using here. But since then, Microsoft has added support for what are called web services within the application. I'll point that out as we come across it. But we actually want to use a web reference because the web services that are exposed by reporting services are written in that kind of older notation. Essentially, Microsoft hasn't updated them for newer versions of SQL Server. I expect they will at some point because there's certainly some benefits for web services or creating services within the project as opposed to web references. But if you accidentally create a web service, then you won't get the full functionality, and you'll have to jump through some hoops, and you may not actually be able to use it. So just be aware of that little quirk. All right, so to do this, I'm going to right-click. Oh, and notice that I don't have a web references or a web service folder at all. Okay, tuck that away in the back of your mind. Okay, so I'm going to right-click on this, and I'm going to add a service reference. A regular reference is a reference to a DLL, to the global assembly cache, to local resources, other things within this project. I want a service reference, and strictly speaking, a web service reference. Okay, and that opens up this web service reference. And I'll move this over and notice that we already have a service references folder for this, even though I haven't created anything yet. All right, now you may be tempted to use this dialog box. Don't. You don't want a service reference, you want a web service reference. And that's the difference that I was talking about. Now, in order to get to that, you have to click on Advanced, and then you get this service reference settings, and then tucked away all the way in the bottom here is this Add Web Reference button. Now, the reason this used to be easier in earlier versions of Visual Studio is that this option was exposed right on the right-click menu here within Solution Explorer. It's not anymore. Service references are really the way to go, but if you're using an older technology, even though it's been updated for SQL Server 2012 and 14, you still have to use a web reference. So don't worry about it, just do it. Okay, so finally we get to this Add Web Reference. And if you've used web references in earlier versions of Visual Studio, this should look familiar. It's the old style dialog box. But it's exactly what we need for this particular application. Now the way this works is that I can do one of two things. I can enter a URL here, and that's what I'm going to end up doing, to a specific web service that I want to access. Or, if I'm not sure what web service I want to use, particularly if I've already defined other web services within this solution, I just created this solution so there aren't any, then I can use this link right there. Or I can look for web services that are exposed on this local machine, whether it's a server or just a local development machine like this is for mine. Or you can also browse UDDI servers on the local network. Everything's on the local machine. I don't have a UDDI server, but this is just a way of discovering web services that are available. And when all of this first came out, web services became the hot new thing. Microsoft made a lot of noise about having these wonderful servers. It would be a repository of all these great web services you could use for free in your applications, like weather and just all kinds of stuff. But that vision just never really panned out. So if you've set up something in your local network, it can be great, but I don't have any of these things, so I need to use the URL option. All right, so I'm going to use this URL option, and I'm going to put in the URL for the web service that I want. So I need HTTP, localhost, or whatever the particular machine name is, and / the name of the reporting services instance, which is report server. And then I want the name of the endpoint. In this case, I want the management endpoint. So I'm going to use report service 2010.asmx. All right, so that's the URL, and I just click on this button right here. And what this is going to do is it's going to go out to that URL and, in a process of discovery, find what's there. And as you can see, it found one web service. This is a fairly large, complex web service. So at this point, what it's doing is it's now reading the details, using that WSDL file, which is a very large file, to discover all of the methods that are exposed and available through this web service. Now, on my local machine, this takes a bit of time, but going across the network, it's likely to take even more, because it's doing quite a bit of work in order to discover what things are available. And you may notice that the little slider bar or timer bar freezes. That's just, I don't know why that does it, but it should be flashing across, indicating that it's actually doing something, and it is, but the little control is broken. Okay, so, and now in this box here, you have a description of what this service is. The Reporting Services web service enables you to manage a report server and its contents, including server settings, security, reports, subscriptions, and data sources. Again, this is the management web service, not the execution web service. And then you can look at all of the different methods that are exposed by this web service. And you can start to see that there are a lot of them. You can get things, you can create things, you can list things, you can render things, you can set things, and so forth. All kinds of different things that you can do with this reporting service. So mainly at this point, this is a form of documentation so you can see what's there. Make sure that you have the right web service, that I didn't accidentally select the execution web service when I want the management web service and all that, but it really doesn't describe what all those methods are. Okay, so the last thing I need to do in this dialog box is change the web reference name, because this is the name that I'm going to use within my application in order to access the service. Now, if I had gone out to some unique domain that had this web service, this default name right here might be something interesting and usable, and maybe that's what I want to use within my application. But going against localhost, kind of worthless. I'm going to have two localhost web services, so not a useful name. So I'm going to name this something fairly verbose. I'm going to call it RS Management Web Reference, because this is a reference, a web reference to that web service. All right, I'm done with the dialog box, so I'm going to add the reference. And now what it's doing is it's going out, taking all that information from the WSDL file with the definition of the web service, and building a lot of code for me. Because what it's done at this point is it's created a number of proxy objects, well, really a single proxy object with a number of classes, with a whole lot of methods and various classes that support my use of this web service. So that's one of the benefits of using a tool like Visual Studio in order to use web services like this. A lot of the messy work is done. You don't need to write all of the tedious, rather complex code that you need in order to access the web service. Now, one downside is that if you wrote your own code for the proxy object, you could write it so that it uses only the parts of the web service that you want to use in your application. But frankly, in a modern application, this really doesn't add that much overhead, so it's not all that big a deal. And so you can see that we now have this RS Management Web Reference, and I have a Web References folder that was created when I created a web reference. I still have the service references. I could clean that up if I wanted to, but there's really no point. It's an empty folder. All right, now this web reference that I just created uses SOAP. Now, this has nothing to do with the cleanliness of the web service or lack thereof. It uses a Simple Object Access Protocol, or SOAP. SOAP, and I looked up the definition in Wikipedia, is, quote, a protocol specification for exchanging structured information in the implementation of web services in computer networks, end quote. That's a pretty good description. In the early days of SOAP, you had to be pretty much an expert in the protocol to use it. But now a lot of tools, as I mentioned, like Visual Studio and many others, hide those messy details behind the scenes and surface its services at a very high level. And that's what we're going to be taking advantage of within this application. So I'm using this SOAP service SOAP protocol really, at a very high level to access the service. Okay, so I can double click on this, and that'll open up the object browser with a link directly to the RS Management Web Reference. And if you're not familiar with it, Object Browser, like Management Studio for SQL Server, is essentially a way to examine the objects that are contained within this application. I now have a web reference, and so this is a namespace that is available within my application. And I can expand that, and you can see all of the various things that were created by Visual Studio to wrap around that web service. As you can see, there is a lot of stuff. And keep in mind, this is just one of 2 web services that Reporting Services implements. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff here. And then you can select different things like catalog item, look at the various members of that object. That happens to be a class. And you can see that there's various properties and methods and so forth that you can use within your application. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't expose any kind of documentation like some Windows and Visual Studio does. In order to look at that, you have to go online. But a lot of the names make a lot of sense. So catalog item, okay, that's going to have something to do with working with items in the catalog. Data set definition probably has something to do with working with data sets, data sources, and so forth, working with data source credentials. You know, everything is pretty well named. But there's one class to rule them all. I'm going to scroll all the way down here. We'll see eventually that there, yeah, right there. It's called Reporting Service 2010. Now this is the ruling object. This is the object that you're going to use within your application as the entree, as the entrance point into all of this goodness, all of these different objects and properties and methods that this web services exposes. All right, so you see me using this in the code, and so you can see that it has a number of methods here. A lot of them are overloaded. There's various options. This is a full-fledged .NET object. And so you're going to use it like an object within an application, and it has all the benefits of the object-based programming that is C# and Visual Basic and the .NET framework. Okay, so it's exposed as a real object that hides all of the low-level details of communicating with the reporting services. Now, if this is a little bit too overwhelming, you can come over here and right-click, and there's some private members and other methods that you might want to not show here. And now this list for all the different objects is going to show just the ones that you're generally going to have direct access to within your application. You can get at the other ones, but they're not things that you're going to use inherently within your application as you use this Reporting Services 2010 object right there. Okay? Just keep in mind that now for this instance of Visual Studio, those changes in what is visible is going to persist. So the next time I start up Visual Studio, create a brand new project, do the same thing, look at Object Browser, those last 2 items are not going to be checked. So if you're looking for something, not seeing it, just keep in mind that that's a persistent setting. Okay, so that is just a brief glimpse into all of the things that are exposed by this web service. And keep in mind that what has happened is that Visual Studio has created all of the code that exposes these classes and methods and so forth to your application. So you have a lot of code now within your project. And so to take a look at that, you can come over here to Solution Explorer. Now on the surface, it looks like all we have is this thing hanging out here. It really doesn't tell you anything about what kind of file this is or anything like that. Well, that of course is because I have this option unchecked, Show All Files. So I'll go ahead and click on that. And now it shows you everything that was created, all the files that were created when you added this web reference. Okay, so this, as it turns out, is just a high-level object that wraps around everything else here. And so there you can see the Report Service 2010 WSDL. It actually downloaded this file from the Report Service, and so it's available to this class for use. And then there's a bunch of other stuff in the reference map. So I'll double-click on that, and you'll see that it is XML that's basically just a configuration file. Really don't need to worry about that too much. It's part of the infrastructure of the web service. But you can expand this node and see that there's a lot of other things, a bunch of data sources and so forth in here, which are then also just config files, essentially, exposed as XML, that contains configuration information about this particular web service. Again, it's all part of the infrastructure that Visual Studio uses in order to manage the process of creating the code. So the important part for our purposes here is this reference.cs. So I'll double click on that. And this is all of the code that was created when I generated the web reference for that web service. And as you can see, little window here, there's a lot of code. And if you scroll down through this, you can find all of the different classes, all of the different methods on the various classes, just everything that was built based on the web service. Now the good news is that you really don't need to worry too much about what's in this file. As you're working with different classes and objects within your application that use this web reference, if something's not making sense or something just isn't working, it might be worthwhile to just right-click on the thing and go to definition and come over here and look at this code and see how it's implemented. That may make some sense. But for the most part, you don't need to worry about it. It's just going to work. It's just going to be there, use it as an object, and access the web reference. All right, so that's really all that I'm going to say about it, other than, again, this is the code that's doing all that, the heavy lifting, when you access the classes and methods of that web reference. And at this point, it's probably worthwhile to once again just say thanks to Microsoft for writing all this messy code so that we don't have to. We can do more productive things, write the custom parts of our applications. All right, another thing to show you over here is that you can go over here into Solution Explorer, and here in references.cs, expand that as well, and you essentially now have an index, a set of bookmarks, if you will, into the various parts of this file. So here's an event. I can expand that. You can see the different fields that it's working with. But a little bit more importantly is I can double-click on event, and it'll jump right to that class definition. So there's the class definition for event. Okay, and you can look at the attributes and look at various code implementations and so forth, whatever it is that you want to explore here. Okay, so I'm going to collapse that, and there's various data sources there. I mentioned the WSDL, so if you want to take a look at the web services definition language behind this web service, it's accessible right there within your project. Okay, so I think that's all the interesting things there. Keep in mind that if you create a service reference, it's going to have similar files. There will be a reference.cs that holds the bulk of the code, but there's going to be a lot of other configuration stuff, some of the code files and so forth. So Visual Studio treats the two things as different, even though nominally they're SOAP-based web services that you're accessing. Okay, so we have one web reference. Now it's time, actually I'm going to clean up my windows a little bit, close all my documents, and come back over here and collapse things. Done looking at that for the moment. And now it's time to add a web reference to the execution web service. Same basic process, with one little quirk that you might expect. Now that I have this web references folder, you might expect that I can just come up here and right-click on it and add a web reference. Sorry, no dice. Unfortunately, for some odd reason that only Microsoft knows, there's no menu item for that. Instead, I either need to go to References or to Service References and select Add Service Reference again. Once again, on Advanced. Once again, on Web Reference. Okay. And now, I could select this because I only need to change this part of the URL. But if I select this, it's immediately going to go out and rediscover that web service, even though I have a web reference there. And that takes several moments. That's a little bit tedious. I don't want to make you sit and watch it go through that again for a service that we're not even going to use and then repeat it for a different one. So I'm just going to go ahead and type in the URL once again. So it's HTTP. As long as I don't close that, I have that little reference down below. So localhost, report server, report execution 2005.asmx. Okay, so again, this is that endpoint to the report execution 2005.asmx. You'll use that same thing no matter what server you're executing it on. Report server, which is the default, which you may have changed, and then whatever machine this is going to, in my case localhost. And now I'll go out and it'll discover the WSDL for that. And I apparently did something wrong. Oops, mistyped. So picky. There we go. I had one too many T's in there. Okay, so now it found one service. Notice it was a little bit quicker. When I was adding the other web reference, I just restarted this machine. I probably had to wake up reporting services. That took a little bit of extra time. But all the components that are involved in using web references is now up and awake and alive on my machine. So just took less time. This is also a relatively simpler web service. Not to say that it's simple. So once again, you can see reporting services, execution services enables report execution. And then you can see that there are still an awful lot of methods that you can use. And as you'll discover, render is the most important one because that's the one that actually renders the report. But along the way, you'll use a number of other methods and classes in order to be able to render that report. Okay, so once again, I need to rename this, and I'm going to give it the RS execution web reference. RS execution web reference. And I'll click on add reference, and after a few moments it'll generate all that code, and now I have the execution web reference, all of the same stuff in here, as well as this reference.cs file. And I can once again open that up, and now this is all of the code for the proxy object for the execution web service. And you can explore that and explore all of the different objects and so forth, including double-clicking on it and opening up the Object Explorer to explore this. Now, be careful that it didn't expand this node. Previously, I had this node expanded. The first time I did this, to be truthful, I just went down and started scrolling down here and said, well, no, this doesn't look right. These aren't the methods of the execution web service. Well, I just didn't notice that I hadn't expanded. This one, the management web service, was still expanded. So I'll collapse that, and now, okay, this starts looking correct. And I can come down here, and I'll point out that the entree, the high-level object that I'm going to work with within this web service is the report execution service. So this is the top-level object that you use within the application. All right, and the last thing I'm going to do is save my work.